The stone walls of Chocta's castle echo with screams that have been silenced for 4 centuries, yet somehow still seem to bounce off the cold granite in the dead of winter nights. If you stand in what remains of the tower where she was walled up alive, you can almost smell it. The metallic tang of iron mixed with the sickly sweet scent of decay that once permeated these halls. It's 1610, and in the bowels of this fortress, a woman of noble blood sits in a bath that isn't filled with water. The liquid is darker, thicker, and it steams in the frigid air of the dungeon. Her pale skin, now wrinkled with age despite her desperate attempts to stop time itself, glistens crimson in the flickering candlelight. She runs her hands through the warm bath, believing with every fibre of her being that this ritual will restore her youth, her beauty, her power. But the girl whose life force now fills this macabre bathtub will never see another sunrise. She was barely 16, a servant girl who had committed the unforgivable sin of accidentally pulling the Countess's hair while brushing it. For this, she paid with everything she had. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a woman whose name became synonymous with such unspeakable cruelty that even hardened investigators of her time struggled to document her crimes. But to understand the monster, we must first understand the woman and the world that created her. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary, at a time when power meant everything and human life, particularly the lives of peasants, meant very little. The Bathory name carried weight across Eastern Europe. They were dragon slayers, vampire hunters, and political power brokers who had shaped the region for generations. But this noble lineage came with a price that wouldn't be fully understood until Elizabeth reached adulthood. The family tree was gnarled with madness, twisted by generations of inbreeding that had concentrated not just wealth and power, but also the seeds of mental instability. Her uncle Stephen was known for his violent rages and sadistic treatment of prisoners. Her aunt Clara was rumoured to be a practitioner of dark arts, teaching young Elizabeth about herbs, potions and rituals that existed on the shadowy border between medicine and witchcraft. Picture young Elizabeth in the corridors of her family's estate, a beautiful child with porcelain skin and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. She was educated as a befitted nobility. She could read and write in 4 languages, discuss philosophy, and carry herself with the bearing of someone born to rule. But in the privacy of the family quarters, she was learning other lessons entirely. At age 11, she witnessed her first execution. A peasant accused of stealing grain was brought before her father, and the sentence was death. But it wasn't the swift justice of a sword to the neck. It was slow, deliberate, designed to send a message. The man was stripped, bound, and left to freeze in the castle courtyard while the family watched from the warmth of their chambers above. Elizabeth pressed her face to the glass, watching as the man's skin turned blue, then purple, then black. She didn't look away, not even when his fingers began to snap off from frostbite. Years later, she would tell her servants that this was the moment she understood the true nature of power, not just the ability to grant life, but the far more intoxicating ability to take it away, slowly while watching the light fade from someone's eyes. When Elizabeth turned 15, she was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander known throughout Hungary as the Black Knight. The marriage was arranged, as all noble marriages were, but Ferenc was not an unwilling participant in Elizabeth's developing tastes for cruelty. In fact, he may have been her first true teacher in the art of inflicting pain. Ferenc spent much of his time away at war, fighting against the Ottoman Empire in campaigns that were as brutal as they were necessary for Hungary's survival. When he returned home, he brought with him not just stories of battle, but techniques of interrogation and torture that he had learned from both enemies and allies. The couple's honeymoon period, if it can be called that, was spent in the dungeons of their castle, experimenting on servants who had displeased them. Elizabeth learned to use hot irons, needles and knives with surgical precision. She discovered that the human body could endure far more pain than she had ever imagined, and that the mind could be broken long before the body gave out. But more importantly, she learned that causing this pain gave her a rush of excitement that nothing else could match. Not fine wine, not expensive clothes, not even the political machinations that occupied most nobles of her station. During these early years of marriage, the killings were sporadic and carefully hidden. A servant girl who broke a valuable vase might be beaten to death, but her body would be buried quietly, and her disappearance explained as a voluntary departure. A stable boy who spoke disrespectfully might be found dead in his stall, apparently kicked by a horse, though the pattern of wounds suggested something far more deliberate. Ferenc died in 1604, officially from illness, though some whispered that even the Black Knight had eventually become uncomfortable with his wife's increasingly extreme appetites. With his death, Elizabeth inherited vast estates, enormous wealth, and most importantly, complete autonomy over her lands and the people who lived on them. She was now 44 years old, beginning to show the first signs of aging that would become her obsession, and for the first time in her life, she had no one to answer to but herself. The first time Elizabeth killed specifically for blood, it was almost by accident. A young servant girl was helping her dress when she accidentally caught the Countess's hair in a brooch, pulling it painfully. Elizabeth spun around and slapped the girl so hard that her ring cut deep into the servant's cheek, sending blood spattering across Elizabeth's hand. As she wiped the blood away, Elizabeth noticed something that would change the course of her life forever. The skin where the blood had touched seemed somehow smoother, more supple, as if the years had melted away from that small patch of flesh. Whether this was real or imagined hardly mattered. Elizabeth believed it completely, and that belief would drive her to commit acts of such savage cruelty that they would echo through history. She began with small experiments. A pinprick here, a small cut there, always justified by some minor transgression on the part of the victim. She would collect the blood in silver bowls and apply it to her face like a cosmetic, studying her reflection for hours to detect any change in her appearance. But as the months passed, Elizabeth became convinced that she needed larger quantities of blood, and that the blood had to be fresh, ideally still warm from the body. This meant that her victims could no longer be merely injured, they had to die. The transformation from sadistic noblewoman to serial killer was gradual but inexorable. At first she would kill perhaps one servant every few months, always choosing girls who were young and beautiful, believing that their youth could somehow be transferred to her through their blood. She developed rituals around these murders, ceremonies that borrowed from the folk magic her aunt had taught her years earlier. The killings took place in the castle's lower chambers, in rooms that had been soundproofed by thick stone walls and heavy tapestries. Elizabeth would have her victims stripped and bound, then slowly tortured to death while their blood was collected in basins beneath them. She believed that terror and pain purified the blood, made it more potent, so she would keep her victims alive as long as possible, sometimes for days, before finally allowing them to die. As Elizabeth's obsession deepened, she surrounded herself with accomplices who shared her twisted appetites, or at least who were too terrified to refuse her commands. Her inner circle consisted of 4 individuals who became extensions of her will: Dorothea Sentes, an elderly woman who served as Elizabeth's personal witch and advisor; Janos Uivari, a dwarf who served as her bodyguard and executioner; Ilona Yor, a servant who helped procure victims; and Katalin Benechki, a washerwoman who disposed of the bodies. Together, this group developed what can only be described as a system of murder. They would identify suitable victims from among the servant girls in the castle, or sometimes lure peasant girls from nearby villages with promises of employment. The victims were always young, always female, and always chosen for their beauty and apparent health. The killing methods varied according to Elizabeth's mood and the supposed transgressions of the victims. Some were beaten to death with clubs, others were burned with red-hot irons or had needles driven under their fingernails. Many were cut with knives in precise patterns that would allow their blood to be collected most efficiently. Elizabeth's favorite method involved suspending victims from the ceiling by their wrists and then cutting them systematically, allowing their blood to drain slowly into the bath below. The castle itself became a charnel house. Bodies were disposed of in multiple ways. Some were buried on the grounds, others were thrown into the river, and still others were fed to the dogs or left in the forest for wild animals to devour. The smell of death permeated the lower levels of the fortress, masked by burning incense and herbs but never entirely eliminated. Remarkably, this systematic slaughter continued for nearly 6 years without official intervention. The disappearance of servant girls was not considered unusual in a society where the poor had few protections and even fewer advocates. Local authorities, if they noticed at all, were either paid to look the other way or simply assumed that the girls had run away to seek their fortunes elsewhere. By 1609, Elizabeth Bathory was 50 years old, and despite her grotesque rituals, time had continued its inexorable march across her face. The woman who had once been celebrated as one of the most beautiful in Hungary now saw only wrinkles and age spots when she looked in her mirror. Her obsession with maintaining her youth had become a consuming madness that drove her to ever more extreme measures. The killings, which had once been monthly occurrences, now happened weekly or even more frequently. Elizabeth had become convinced that the blood of peasant girls was losing its potency, that their lower breeding made their life force weaker. She began to seek out victims from the minor nobility, young women of good families who might have more powerful blood. This change in victim selection would prove to be her downfall. But Elizabeth was too deep in her madness to see the danger. She began inviting young noblewomen to her castle, under the pretense of finishing their education or teaching them the arts of managing a household. These girls, unlike the peasant servants, had families who would miss them, who would ask questions, who had the political connections to demand answers. The first noble victim was a distant cousin, a 16-year-old girl named Anna, who had been sent to learn court etiquette. Anna's parents received letters supposedly from their daughter, describing her studies and expressing contentment with her situation. But the letters were forgeries, written by Elizabeth herself after Anna had been tortured to death over the course of several days. When Anna failed to return home as promised, her parents came to the castle demanding answers. Elizabeth received them graciously, expressing surprise and concern about Anna's disappearance. She suggested that the girl might have eloped with a young man she had met, and even offered to help search for her. But Anna's mother noticed something that chilled her to the bone. Elizabeth was wearing Anna's favorite necklace, a distinctive piece that had been in their family for generations. Word began to spread among the noble families of the region that young women who went to Chaktit's castle had a disturbing tendency to vanish without a trace. Parents began refusing Elizabeth's invitations, and those few who did send their daughters insisted on frequent letters and regular visits. The investigation that would finally bring down Elizabeth Bathory began almost by accident. King Matthias II of Hungary had been looking for a way to seize the vast Bathory estates, partly to gain control of their wealth, and partly to cancel debts that the royal treasury owed to the family. When reports of missing noblewomen began to reach the court, the king saw an opportunity. He appointed György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and ironically a relative of Elizabeth's late husband, to investigate the allegations. Thurzó was a careful, methodical man who understood that accusations against someone of Elizabeth's status required ironclad evidence. He began by interviewing the families of missing girls, documenting their stories and collecting physical evidence of their daughters' disappearances. The investigation took months, during which Elizabeth continued her killings, seemingly oblivious to the danger closing around her. By late 1610, Thurzó had compiled testimony from dozens of witnesses, servants who had escaped the castle, family members of victims, local officials who had been bribed to stay silent. The picture that emerged was so horrific that even hardened officials found it difficult to believe. According to the witness statements, Elizabeth had killed between 80 and 650 young women over the course of her murderous career. The exact number would never be known, as many of the victims were peasants whose disappearances had never been officially recorded. But the physical evidence was undeniable: blood-stained torture devices, rooms that reeked of death, and human remains scattered throughout the castle grounds. On December 29, 1610, Thurzó arrived at Chaktit's castle with a contingent of soldiers and a royal warrant for Elizabeth's arrest. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The raid on Chaktit Castle began at dawn, when the thick stone walls were still shrouded in the morning mist that rose from the surrounding forests. Thurzó had planned the timing carefully, early enough to catch the inhabitants before they could destroy evidence, but late enough that there would be sufficient light to document what they found. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from the smell that hit them as soon as they entered the main hall. It was the unmistakable odor of death, so thick and cloying that several of the soldiers had to step outside to vomit, but they pressed on, following the scent deeper into the castle's bowels. In the lower chambers they found scenes that defied description. One room contained the bodies of 2 young women who had been tortured to death so recently that their blood was still warm. Another held the partially dismembered remains of several victims, their body parts arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of ritual significance. But the most horrific discovery was in Elizabeth's private chambers, where they found her personal bath, a large silver tub filled with what appeared to be blood. The liquid was still warm, and floating in it were chunks of flesh and human hair. Elizabeth herself was found nearby, her own body covered in blood that clearly wasn't her own. The investigators also discovered Elizabeth's personal diary, written in her own hand, which documented her crimes in meticulous detail. The entries read like the fevered dreams of a madwoman, describing her theories about the rejuvenating properties of blood and her experiments with different methods of extraction. Some passages were so disturbing that they were sealed away and never released to the public. Among the most chilling discoveries were the bodies of several young noblewomen who had been reported missing over the previous months. Their corpses showed signs of prolonged torture, and chemical analysis of their remains suggested they had been kept alive for days or even weeks before finally being allowed to die. Elizabeth Bathory herself was never formally tried. As a member of the high nobility, she was technically beyond the reach of conventional justice, and King Matthias was reluctant to set a precedent that might someday be used against other noble families. Instead, she was placed under house arrest while her accomplices faced trial for their crimes. The trial of Dorothea Sentes, Janos Ujvari, Ilona Jor, and Katalin Benecki began in early 1611 and quickly became a sensation throughout Europe. The prosecutors presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic murder on a scale that shocked even the most cynical observers. Witness after witness testified about the horrors they had seen or heard about. Former servants described being forced to watch as their fellow workers were tortured to death. Local peasants told of finding body parts in the forest near the castle. Officials admitted to accepting bribes to ignore reports of missing women. The physical evidence was equally damning. The investigators had found detailed records of the murders, including sketches of torture devices and notes about which methods produced the most blood. They had discovered chambers specifically designed for killing, with drainage systems to collect blood and soundproofing to muffle screams. But perhaps the most compelling testimony came from the accomplices themselves. Faced with the certainty of execution, they began to turn on each other, each trying to minimize their own role while implicating the others. Their confessions provided a window into the daily operations of Elizabeth's murder machine. Dorothea Sentes, the elderly woman who had served as Elizabeth's advisor, claimed that she had been following orders and had no choice but to participate. But witnesses testified that she had been an enthusiastic participant, often suggesting new methods of torture and personally conducting some of the murders. Janos Ujvari, the dwarf, admitted to killing several victims personally, but claimed he had been acting under duress. However, other testimony suggested that he had taken pleasure in the work, often volunteering for the most brutal tasks. The trial lasted several months, during which time public opinion turned decisively against the defendants. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, and the crimes too horrific for any other outcome. All four were found guilty and sentenced to death, though their executions were carried out in different ways based on their perceived level of culpability. While her accomplices faced justice, Elizabeth Bathory remained confined to her castle, officially under investigation but effectively beyond the reach of the law. King Matthias and his advisors debated for months about what to do with her. Execution was legally impossible given her noble status, but allowing her to go free was politically unthinkable given the scale of her crimes. The solution they finally settled on was as cruel as it was creative. Elizabeth would be walled up alive in her own castle, confined to a small set of rooms with no possibility of escape. She would be fed through a slot in the wall, but would never again see the outside world or have contact with other human beings except for her guards. The walling up took place in late 1611, about a year after her arrest. Elizabeth was confined to 3 rooms in the upper tower of Chaktis Castle: a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a prayer chamber. The doorways were bricked up, leaving only small openings for food and waste removal. The windows were barred and shuttered, cutting off her view of the outside world. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth's reaction to her imprisonment as a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had apparently convinced herself that her noble status would protect her from serious consequences, and the reality of permanent confinement came as a shock. She spent her first months in captivity, alternately pleading with her guards and threatening them with dire consequences when she was inevitably freed. But as the months turned to years, Elizabeth's defiance gave way to a kind of resigned madness. Guards reported hearing her talking to herself for hours at a time, sometimes arguing with invisible presences, sometimes reciting what sounded like incantations or spells. She occasionally claimed to see the ghosts of her victims, describing their appearances in vivid detail to anyone who would listen. The irony of her situation was not lost on those who knew her story. Elizabeth, who had killed hundreds of young women in a futile attempt to preserve her own youth and beauty, was now trapped in a situation where she would age and deteriorate without anyone to witness her decline. The vanity that had driven her to murder was being punished in the most fitting way possible. Elizabeth Bathory lived in her walled-up chambers for nearly 4 years, from 1611 until her death in 1614. During this time, she became increasingly isolated, not just physically but mentally, retreating into a world of delusions and fantasies that only occasionally intersected with reality. Guards who brought her food reported that she often didn't recognize them, sometimes addressing them as long-dead servants or family members. She would spend hours staring at her reflection in a small mirror, one of the few possessions she had been allowed to keep, apparently fascinated by the changes that age and confinement were working on her face. Her physical health deteriorated rapidly under the conditions of her imprisonment. The lack of sunlight and exercise, combined with a diet of simple prison fare, took its toll on a woman who had once lived in luxury. Her famous beauty faded completely, replaced by the haggard appearance of someone who had lost all hope. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of her punishment was the silence. Elizabeth, who had once commanded dozens of servants and held the power of life and death over hundreds of people, now had no one to talk to except the guards who brought her meals. The woman who had once been surrounded by the screams of her victims now lived in a world where the only sounds were her own voice and the occasional footsteps of her jailers. On August 21, 1614, the guards arrived with Elizabeth's morning meal to find her dead in her bed. She was 54 years old, and by all accounts appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep, a mercy that she had never granted to any of her victims. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, though some contemporaries suspected suicide. Her body showed no signs of violence, and there were no indications that she had been poisoned or harmed by her guards. It seemed that after years of trying to cheat death through the murder of innocents, Elizabeth Bathory had finally succumbed to the same fate that awaits all mortals. The death of Elizabeth Bathory did not end her story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Her crimes were so shocking, so far beyond the normal scope of human evil, that they quickly transcended mere historical fact and entered the realm of legend and myth. The immediate aftermath of her death was carefully managed by the authorities. Her body was initially buried in the church at Chaktasy, but local residents complained that her presence was desecrating holy ground. She was eventually moved to a family crypt at Exed, where her grave was deliberately left unmarked to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid pilgrimage. The castle itself was abandoned almost immediately after Elizabeth's death. Local people avoided it, claiming that it was haunted by the spirits of her victims. Over the centuries, the building gradually fell into ruin, though even today visitors report strange sounds and unexplained phenomena among the crumbling walls. But it was the story itself that proved to have the longest life. Within a few decades of Elizabeth's death, her crimes had been embellished and exaggerated until she became a figure of almost supernatural evil. Some accounts claimed she had bathed in the blood of over 650 victims. Others suggested that she had made pacts with demons or practiced black magic on a grand scale. The legend of Elizabeth Bathory spread throughout Europe, inspiring countless stories, books, and eventually films. She became the template for the female vampire in popular culture, a beautiful but deadly creature who fed on the blood of the innocent. The historical Elizabeth, a mentally ill woman driven by vanity and sadism, was transformed into a mythical figure of pure evil. Modern historians have worked to separate fact from fiction in Elizabeth's story, but the task is complicated by the loss of many original documents and the tendency of contemporary accounts to sensationalize her crimes. What we know for certain is that she killed dozens of young women, possibly more than 100, in pursuit of a twisted fantasy about preserving her youth through blood. To understand Elizabeth Bathory, we must look beyond the sensational details of her crimes to examine the psychological and social factors that created such a monster. Her story is not just about individual madness, but about the corrupting effects of absolute power and the way that social institutions can enable and protect evil. Elizabeth was born into a world where the lives of common people had little value, where nobles could literally get away with murder as long as they confined their victims to the lower classes. The feudal system that gave her power over hundreds of people also insulated her from the consequences of abusing that power. For most of her killing career, she faced no oversight, no questioning, no accountability of any kind. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts suggests a woman who suffered from what we would now recognize as severe personality disorders. Her complete lack of empathy, her need for control, her grandiose sense of self-importance, and her willingness to inflict suffering for personal gratification all point to psychopathic tendencies that were exacerbated by her social position. But Elizabeth was also a product of her family's genetic legacy. The inbreeding that was common among European nobility in this period often resulted in mental instability, and the Bathory family had a documented history of mental illness and violent behavior. Elizabeth's crimes may have been extreme, but they were not entirely without precedent in her family line. The role of superstition and folk belief in her crimes cannot be overlooked either. Elizabeth genuinely believed that bathing in blood would preserve her youth, a belief that was not entirely uncommon in her time. The line between medicine and magic was blurry in the 17th century, and many people accepted that certain rituals could have physical effects on the body. What made Elizabeth different was not her beliefs, but her willingness to act on them, regardless of the human cost. She had the power to obtain victims, the isolation to hide her crimes, and the psychological makeup to enjoy the process of killing. The combination of these factors created a perfect storm of evil that resulted in one of history's most prolific serial killers. In all the centuries of fascination with Elizabeth Bathory, one aspect of her story has often been overlooked: the humanity of her victims. These were not abstract figures in a historical drama, but real young women with hopes, dreams, fears, and families who mourned their loss. Most of the victims were servant girls, typically between the ages of 14 and 20, who had come to work at the castle to earn money for their families or to learn skills that might help them find better positions elsewhere. They were often the daughters of peasants, people who lived on the margins of society and had few protections against the whims of their social superiors. Some of their names have survived in the court records: Anna, who was torn apart by dogs after being tortured; Kata, who was burned with red-hot irons; Pola, who was beaten to death with clubs. These girls had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to catch the attention of a woman whose appetite for cruelty knew no bounds. The noble victims, though fewer in number, were equally tragic. These were young women who had been sent to the castle by their families, trusting that Elizabeth's reputation and social standing would ensure their safety. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The psychological impact on the survivors, the servants who escaped, the family members who lost daughters, the local communities that lived in fear cannot be measured. For generations, the mere mention of the Bathory name was enough to cause people to make the sign of the cross and mutter protective prayers. It's important to remember that behind every historical monster are the forgotten victims whose suffering made the monster's reputation possible. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes were not just abstract evils, but concrete acts of violence against specific individuals who deserved to live full lives, to love and be loved, to contribute to their communities and families. The story of Elizabeth Bathory might seem like a relic from a darker age, but the psychological and social dynamics that enabled her crimes are still present in our modern world. The combination of power, isolation, and mental illness that created the Blood Countess continues to produce monsters in every generation. The abuse of power by those in positions of authority is a constant throughout human history. Whether it's political leaders who commit genocide, religious figures who abuse their congregations, or wealthy individuals who exploit the vulnerable, the pattern remains the same. Power corrupts, and absolute power, the kind that Elizabeth wielded over her servants, corrupts absolutely. Modern serial killers often share psychological traits with Elizabeth Bathory: the need for control, the lack of empathy, the ability to compartmentalize their crimes while maintaining a normal public facade. These characteristics appear again and again in criminal profiles. The main difference is that today's killers rarely have the institutional protection that Elizabeth enjoyed for so many years. The role of complicity in enabling evil is another constant theme. Elizabeth could not have committed her crimes without the assistance of her accomplices, just as modern atrocities require the cooperation or willful blindness of many individuals. The servants who said nothing, the officials who looked the other way, the family members who suspected but didn't investigate, all bear some responsibility for the continuation of her crimes. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's story reminds us that evil is not always exotic or supernatural. It can emerge from the most privileged backgrounds, hide behind the most respectable facades, and operate within the most civilized societies. The monsters are not always obvious. Sometimes they are the people we least suspect, the ones who seem to have everything but still hunger for more. As we close this dark chapter of history, it's worth returning to that moment when Elizabeth first saw her own blood on her skin and believed she had found the secret to eternal youth. In that instant, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life and death. She chose to believe that her own existence was worth more than the lives of everyone around her. The great irony of Elizabeth Bathory's story is that her desperate attempt to preserve her youth and beauty ultimately led to their complete destruction. The woman who killed hundreds to avoid aging died prematurely, alone and forgotten, her beauty long since faded, and her name forever associated with horror rather than admiration. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her legacy is how it reflects our own cultural obsessions. In a world where people undergo countless procedures to maintain their youth, where the beauty industry generates billions of dollars from our fears of aging, where social media creates new pressures to maintain a perfect appearance, Elizabeth Bathory's motivations don't seem quite as foreign as they should. The difference is one of degree, not kind. We may not literally bathe in blood, but we live in a society that often values appearance over substance, youth over wisdom, and individual desires over collective welfare. The seeds of Elizabeth's madness exist in all of us. What matters is whether we choose to nurture them or resist them. The castle at Chaktis still stands, though much of it has crumbled over the centuries. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the macabre history, but the locals still prefer to avoid the place. They say that on certain nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear echoes of those long-ago screams carried in the air. But perhaps what we should really be listening for is not the cries of the dead, but the whispers of the living, the small voices that tell us when we're going too far, when our desires are becoming destructive, when our pursuit of our own happiness is causing suffering for others. Elizabeth Bathory stopped listening to those voices, and the result was a tragedy that echoes through the centuries. In the end, the Blood Countess achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind she sought. Instead of being remembered as a beautiful woman who never aged, she is remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, untreated mental illness, and the human capacity for evil. Her story serves as a mirror, reflecting back to us the darkest possibilities of human nature and challenging us to choose a better path. The blood has long since dried, the screams have faded into silence, and the woman who believed she could cheat death has herself been dead for over 4 centuries. But the questions her life raises about power, vanity, and the value of human life remain as relevant today as they were in the dungeons of Chaktis Castle. In studying monsters like Elizabeth Bathory, we learn not just about the past, but about the eternal struggle between our better angels and our darkest impulses, a struggle that continues in every human heart, in every generation, until the end of time.